Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to see everyone. I've been so excited about this session. So my name is Alix Gould-Werth, and I lead our work on family economic security here at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. I hope I just didn't get cut off. Everyone, I was just saying I'm excited to be here, and I lead our family economic security work. So it's a real pleasure to be moderating today's session, which is entitled Improving Access to Income Supports to Boost the Macroeconomy and Individual Well-Being. We'll begin with a presentation by Alix Bell entitled UI Benefit Generosity, Labor Supply, and Job Outcomes from 2002 to 2020. Evidence from California UI records. Then we'll continue on the unemployment insurance train with a presentation from Schnorr entitled Unemployment Insurance Eligibility and At-Fault Job Loss, Implications for Recipiency, Unemployment Duration, and Earning. Then we will turn to Eliza Forsythe for some discussant remarks on the Schnorr and Bell papers. And we'll move on to the last two papers of the session. First, Steve Woodbury presenting Race, Gender, and Denied Claims for Unemployment Insurance, the Role of the Employer. And then Derek Wu presenting Certification and Recertification in Welfare Programs, What Happens when Automation Goes Wrong. And then finally, we'll have some discussant marks on the Woodbury and Wu papers from Kristen Harknett. So the plan is to have about 10 minutes for each presentation and each discussant. And just to warn you, you might hear me interrupting remarks verbally to keep time. It's not because anyone is doing anything wrong. All our presenters are great and well-behaved, but just sometimes it's hard to see those Zoom reminders when you're in the middle of giving a great presentation, as I'm sure many of you have experienced. So after we get through the papers and discussant remarks, we'll turn to question and answer, which I'll moderate, and I'm very much looking forward to that. I think one of the best things about our grantee conference is the robust participation that often happens during the Q&A session. So I encourage you to submit questions into the Q&A box that you'll see on your screen on a rolling basis. So just like as they pop into your head, stick it in the Q&A box. And then I'll try to get to as many of them as possible during the Q&A at the end of the session. When you're putting in those questions, please feel free to include your name and affiliation so I can give you credit for all those brilliant questions. And you can also feel free to use the chat function if there's like resources or thoughts you'd like to share with the full audience in real time. So those of you who know me at all will know that getting to hear this particular lineup of presentations and discussants really makes me feel like being a kid in the candy store. This is like my favorite topic. So I'm going to really not delay us any further. I'm going to quickly drop a note in the chat about the tenor of participation that we hope to see throughout the grantee conference, and there will be no further delays. So I'm going to turn it over to Alix Bell to kick us off.
Thanks so much, Alix. Let's see here. Okay. So thanks very much for having me here today. My name is Alix Bell. This is joint work with TJ Hedin, Josh Schnorr, who's also here today, and Till van Wachter, and it's research on UI benefit generosity and labor supply. So we're motivated by two key questions in this paper. The first question is the classic question of how does job search behavior for UI claimants vary over the business cycle? And there's been contrasting evidence on this question in the US, but it's of great policy importance in determining optimal UI benefit generosity during downturns. The new insight that will contribute with this paper is that it's going to be important to distinguish between weekly survival elasticities as opposed to total duration elasticities when thinking about the business cycle. The second question that we're going to weigh in on, closely related, is how did claimants respond to the large increases in emergency added benefits during the pandemic? And this is a topic of very active research recently. Many of the other authors are here today, and we're going to contribute to that also. So the workhorse research design that we're going to use is called the regression kink design. And we're going to apply this design to over 20 years of panel administrative UI claims microdata from the state of California. So what I've drawn here is the weekly benefit amount schedule as a function of claimants' prior earnings. And what's going on here is claimants' benefits increase about 50 cents on the dollar of prior earnings up until a threshold of $450 of weekly benefits, after which point benefits no longer increase. So this naturally kinked design provides an experiment by which we can examine the effect of benefit generosity for claimants who are very similar to each other. So here on the x-axis, I've plotted claimants' highest quarter rate wages relative to the kink. On the left side of that discontinuity, the left side of that red line, we see claimants whose benefits are increasing by 50 cents per dollar of prior earnings. And as benefits increase, so does the likelihood of 8-week survival increase. And then what we see on the right side of the kink is an inflection in the slopes. So once the benefits are capped at $450, the change in the survival function, the slope falls. So the way that the research design is going to work is we'll fit a line on each side of the curve, and the dashed line is going to represent the counterfactual survival function if there were no kink in the benefit schedule, if it just continued straight up. And then the difference between the dashed line and the solid line, we're going to call the sharp difference in slopes to be the effect of the lack of added benefits. And that's the intuition for how we'll use this kink in the benefit schedule to identify the effect of weekly added benefits on claimants' labor supply. And the last point to make here is we'll be framing all estimates in terms of elasticities to facilitate comparisons across years and also comparisons to prior literature. So in elasticity, of course, we're going to show a percent change in the outcome relative to a 1% change in benefits. So putting that in common units. Now, here are some first results. This is a whole bunch of survival elasticities at different points of the survival curve and in different years. So let's start with the green line that I've called out here. That's the 8-week survival elasticity. We've plotted a point for every year over the last approximately 20 years. And what we see here, the sort of key important takeaway is that 8-week survival elasticity is relatively constant over time between around 0.3 or 0.4, but importantly, it's not fluctuating much with the business cycles. And what the other lines show is different points in the survival curve have different survival elasticities. In general, we find higher survival elasticities for later weeks in the survival curve, essentially because there are fewer people left at that point. But the key takeaway here is that there's not a cyclicality in this weekly behavioral response to UI benefit generosity. I'm going to show a contrasting result now, and this is total UI duration over the same time period yearly. So this is showing for a 1% change in benefits, how much does the total duration change as opposed to that weekly survival? And the contrast here is we see duration elasticities increase quite substantially in the Great Recession and subsequently decline. And this is actually consistent with some prior literature from Card et al., who are finding a high duration elasticity during the Great Recession and then falling during the expansion. So we want to understand why there's this conflicting result in the cyclicality. And the key is understanding that during this period when the duration elasticity was very high, that was a period when policies were in effect that allowed claimants to extend their duration. So to reconcile these two seemingly contradictory results, what do we have? We have total duration responds more to benefit generosity during the Great Recession, but the weekly survival response that's up to 26 weeks are showing no changes over the business cycle. So what we show in the paper is that the cyclicality of the total duration response is due to the availability of extensions. And it's not telling us anything about diminished job search behavior earlier in the spell, because that would be showing through in the survival elasticities. The interpretation, and this is important, the interpretation is that workers' behavioral responses to UI don't seem to rise during downturns. And policy-wise, this is motivation for more generous UI policy during downturns. Now, that was what we've seen so far over the business cycle. I want to extend the analysis now to the pandemic. And this is where things get even more interesting, because the emergency added benefits at times more than doubled the benefit levels, at least in California, where benefits normally top out at $450 per week. And at some points, added benefits were as high as $600 early in the pandemic. So when we extend the analysis to the pandemic, I'm going to show you elasticities two ways. I'll show you elasticities both with and without the added benefits. It gets a little tricky to think about the directions of this, but take my word that directionally, including the added benefits in the calculation, is always going to increase the estimates of elasticities. The intuition here is $1 is going to essentially be a smaller percentage change once we include a bigger level of added benefits. And for this analysis, we're going to focus on the roughly 1 million claimants in California who entered the UI system in March of 2020 to make tracking easier if we just start with that big mass of claimants that entered at the beginning of the pandemic. So here, I just want to start, I'm going to show you the elasticities over the first year of the pandemic, but I just want to start by highlighting how the added benefits are comparing each week. So at the beginning of the pandemic, the program was called FPUC, introduced $600 of added benefits, which I'm showing here at the bottom. That expired at the end of August, and President Trump introduced a sort of stopgap measure that introduced $300 of added benefits for a few weeks. That expired and there were no added benefits for a while. And then at the start of the year, the Congress came back in with $300 added benefits. So there's really a lot of movement in that sort of added benefit top up over the first year of the pandemic. Another point I want to give you for reference is data that we've already seen, just presented a little bit differently. Over the week of the spell, these are survival elasticities, and I've collected it from those 20 years prior. So what you see is usually it's ending at 26 weeks because most of the year UI is capped at 26 weeks. And there are some years with extensions that we're able to draw it farther out. But we see this general trend that survival elasticity is increasing somewhat monotonically, somewhat smoothly in the week of the spell at which we're estimating survival. And that's for the prior 2 decades. And now I've drawn this orange line, and this is what we observed for that early pandemic cohort. So for the early pandemic cohort, this is their elasticity to base benefits, not taking into account the added benefits at all. So clearly it's much lower. It's the same sort of smooth pattern, smoothly increasing. What I want to show you next, which is interesting, is the elasticity to benefits when we take into account the added benefits as well. And what we see here is a very different pattern. So remember, I told you a little bit confusing, but it's going to be higher when there are times of added benefits, but the shape is much different. It's much less smooth, much less monotonic. This is the key takeaway I want you to get from this slide about the pandemic. The behavioral responses to benefit generosity were pretty low during the pandemic, regardless of how you want to calculate benefit generosity. If you think claimants are responding to the base benefits or the base and added benefits, the responses are much lower than we've seen in the past 2 decades. There is a more nuanced point here, which you'll have to read into with the shape, and I won't get into it that much here. But if you buy into the shape of the survivor function, that you think people's true survival elasticity should be a smooth function of the week of the spell, this is going to suggest that people didn't respond much to weekly changes in added benefits. Essentially, it's saying the blue line is not the most plausible way to look at the data. And it might be that people are responding more to the base benefits than they are to the added benefits. But the main takeaway I want to harp on is just the low elasticity in general during the pandemic. I want to be respectful of everyone's time and conclude with a summary here of what we've found in just a short 10-minute talk. We produced RKD estimates of behavioral responses to UI over the business cycle and during the pandemic in California claims microdata. Prior to the pandemic, we saw behavioral responses to UI have been steady over the last 2 decades. And this is policy motive for more generous UI during downturns because we don't see moral hazard increasing during downturns. Fast forwarding during the pandemic, our most recent data, we're seeing behavioral response to UI that's even lower than expected. There's an open question as to why it's so low. I think people have put forward theories. There could be lack of jobs due to the public health crisis contributing here. Could be liquidity from other government transfers like economic impact payments, the child tax credit expansion. I think these are all grounds for fruitful future research. But the bottom line is that this suggests that the pandemic UI expansions were really good tools to ensure workers against job loss and to distribute fiscal stimulus with only minimal distortions to labor supply. That's what we find. So that's all I have time for today. Thank you. And I look forward to continuing the conversation both online and in DC.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that, Alix. We'll turn it over to Geoff next. And I just want to encourage folks. I definitely had some questions as Alix was talking. And so I hope that all of you will put your questions into the Q&A box as we go along. All right.
Okay, thanks, Alex and Alex. Okay, so my name is Geoff Schnorr. I'm a postdoc joint with the California Policy Lab and the state of California's Employment Development Department. That's the agency that runs the UI program in California. Today, I'm presenting work that's co-authored with John Cohen, a grad student at MIT. And this is about workers whose claims for UI are denied because they were at fault for their job loss. So what does it mean to be at fault? Contrary to popular belief, this does not just mean that you quit or you were fired. Instead, claimants are going to be denied if they quit without good cause or were fired for misconduct, right? So this is a little nuanced. I want to tell you a little bit more about how this is implemented. So in the US, states are going to define what those two terms, good cause and misconduct, mean exactly. And then if an employer or a claimant reports that a quit or a firing for cause took place, a caseworker will interview both parties and make what's called an eligibility determination. So 3 things to highlight here. First, this is a policy choice, right? States have to define these terms. So the strictness of these criteria is a policy choice. And the goal of this paper is going to be to inform that policy choice. Second, we see from the second bullet here that not all claimants go through this process, right? Only some claimants have to have these interviews. And the reason why one claim would or would not go through the process is based on what they and their employer say to the UI agency. So this is going to create the potential for differential exposure here, right? Some groups of claimants might be more or less likely to have this happen to them, to be affected by this. Third thing to point out, this is very important quantitatively. In 2019, nationally, there were 0.11 at-fault eligibility determinations per claim. And that stat varies widely state to state, right? So this is an important policy choice. So as the title of the paper kind of hinted at, we're going to try to speak to this issue for 3 different research questions, really, that we think are of interest to policymakers. So who is screened out by these rules, and how does that contribute to low recipiency rates? Second, we want to estimate the fiscal externality from expanding eligibility on this margin. Third, what is the effect of these denials on the quality of the next job? So earnings, for example. So the literature on all 3 of these questions is pretty limited. There has been some recent work, including by people in this Zoom call right now, on this first and third question. I'd love to tell you more about those papers. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus on one thing for today, and that's going to be this fiscal externality. So what I mean by this is that theoretically, we would expect there to be a moral hazard effect, right? Where denial leads to shorter non-employment spells. So as we saw in the last talk, there's a lot of literature on this already for other UI policy parameters. So benefit levels or duration, for example. Importantly, those might not apply here. This is a different context. These are different people treated by a different treatment, right? So you might expect a different response. So today, I'm going to try to answer 2 research questions for you. So first, what is the causal effect of separation-based denial on non-employment duration? Second, how does that effect compare to that of other changes to benefit generosity in the literature? We're going to do this using administrative data from California's UI program. So what do we do and what do we find? For the first question, we're going to exploit quasi-random assignment to groups of caseworkers who importantly have varying denial propensities, sort of a judge IV setup. We're going to find that eligibility only modestly lengthens non-employment spells. So what does modestly mean, right? For that, we turn to the second question. What we need to do here is put these estimates on sort of equal footing with estimates for other parameters in the literature. We're going to do that by first transforming those estimates to the dollar cost that they imply for the government, right? So additional UI paid and lost tax revenue while people are out of work. And then scale that by the mechanical cost to the government of these expansions. That's a different cost. You could think of this as the additional UI dollars that would be paid if the spell length was unchanged, right? Even if people who are approved don't have longer spells, you're making them eligible, so that is costing the government some money in a direct transfer. So what we find here is that that scaled fiscal externality for these expansions is an order of magnitude smaller than that of increases to benefit generosity, for example, levels or durations. So this looks like a very low cost way to expand UI. So really quick, I want to start by giving you a sense of who's exposed to this in our data. So we start with a sample of about 23 million claims who are otherwise eligible. Basically means they earned enough money to receive UI. We find that about 30% of those have one of these eligibility determinations. 13% are denied, and 9% go on to not receive any payments. Importantly, that gap between the denials and the payments is appeals, right? Which makes some sense. So a lot of people here, right? That's the important point. We can also show you that as we go from left to right here across these columns, the people who are more exposed to this are generally less advantaged. They earn less money, they are younger, they are more likely to be female, and more likely to be non-white. Also, the bottom row here will show you a peek at our main outcome, and this is going to be consecutive quarters unemployed, measured as zero earnings in the earnings data. And so here we see kind of a suggestion that there's no real effect of these denials on spell length, but you might imagine that people who are denied are different than those who are approved. So enter our research design. So in California, claims are assigned to offices, which you could think of as groups of caseworkers, via the last 2 digits of their social. So the last 2 digits of your social are quasi-randomly assigned. There's some other papers that have used this for other questions. And importantly, we're going to find that offices have meaningfully different denial rates. So this allows us to implement this empirical design, basically an instrumental variable setup where office dummies are the instruments and our endogenous treatment is the receipt of any payment. So that 5 percentage point range in an office level approval means, right, might seem a little low. It is enough. Our first stage F-stat is 77, so we do think we're in good shape there. Because of that, the estimates I'm going to show you are estimated by 2-stage least squares. In the paper, we do some more fancy stuff to deal with possible many weak IB bias. Ask me in the Q&A if you want to hear more about that. But I want to draw your attention to the main result, last column. People who are approved have unemployment spells that are about 1/4 longer than those who are denied, right? Relative to a control mean of a little over 2 quarters. So we're calling that modest, right? Why do we say that? So we want to go back to this idea that we're going to try to scale this in a certain way to compare it to other estimates. So again, this scaling, we're going to take that behavior change that we just estimated. We're going to turn it into dollar terms. So now I have this fiscal externality, right? This is the additional UI dollars paid and lost dollars in tax revenue while people are out of work. And then we're going to scale that by the mechanical transfer, right? So this is the additional UI dollars paid if there were no behavior change. This is also often referred to as a behavioral cost mechanical cost ratio in this recent paper by Johannes Schmieder and Till von Wachter. A little dense here, I admit. I think a picture can kind of help clarify this. So I'm going to show you one. I'll show you 2 survival curves. So these will show you the share of people still unemployed as they move throughout their unemployment spell. So the bottom curve is before policy change, and the top curve is after. This policy change that I'm showing you here as an example increases the duration of benefits from L to L plus DL. After the change, this curve shifts up because people stay unemployed longer, right? More people are unemployed at each point in the spell. So the vertical gap in red between those 2 curves is this fiscal externality that we're after, right? This is the behavior change. There's also this mechanical transfer in blue here, right? And the idea we're trying to communicate is that even if there were no behavior change, if these 2 survival curves were on top of each other, this blue space would still exist, right? And so that's the transfer that we're going to scale our fiscal externality estimates by in order to compare across contexts. To draw a similar picture for a policy change like ours, where we're expanding UI on the extensive margin. These curves are made up, but you might imagine that that kind of a change would have a bigger fiscal externality, right? Because it's a bigger change, a lot more money being given to these people. At the same time, it's also going to have a much bigger mechanical transfer, right, for the same reason. So we're going to implement this procedure for 4 different policy parameters. First, separation-based eligibility. This is what we estimate our results. Second, monetary eligibility, which just means that you have to earn enough money to receive UI. We're going to replicate a recent paper on this in our data. And then for benefit levels and durations, we're going to take some of these ratios helpfully constructed in a recent lit review and graph them. So what we see here is our results. These 2 box and whiskers are for benefit duration changes and benefit level changes. And these 2 horizontal lines are the extensive margin changes that we estimate in our data. So what we see here is that expanding UI on the extensive margin is much lower cost than expanding on the intensive margin, at least by our estimates. So this gives us our main conclusion, which is that these eligibility expansions, either loosening at-fault eligibility criteria or lowering minimum earnings cutoffs, are a very low-cost way to increase UI benefit generosity. A full accounting of the welfare impacts of expanding eligibility in this way requires a lot more, right? We list a few things that you'd want to think about here, and our ongoing work is going to consider those things and other related questions. But that's all I have for today. So thank you for listening.
Great. Thanks so much, Geoff. Those were two fascinating papers, and I can't wait to hear what Eliza has to say about them. So I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Okay, let me just share my screen. All right, does that look good? Can we see my slides? Perfect. Okay, great. So I'm discussing these two very interesting papers. Thanks very much for inviting me. So I thought what might be useful to start with is just to kind of think a little bit about a schema of what's going on in terms of when we're thinking about who's receiving unemployment insurance benefits, right? So initially the worker is going to have some sort of separation event. This could be thinking about these at-fault determinations. There's lots of different things that could lead to this separation event. Then the worker is going to decide to apply, right? So before we even get into the unemployment insurance system, the worker has to decide to apply, which could differ across different types of workers or cyclically. Then we'll have sort of this process for whether they're approved or not, and in particular this determination of whether or not they're eligible, including these monetary eligibility and the reasons for separation. And then they'll receive benefits in a particular week. There's lots of reasons why we might exit from receiving benefits, right? So the one we're hoping for is they find a job. But also they could exhaust their benefits, they could fail to recertify, right? So there's reasons why we might see sort of this slippage between who is receiving benefits in a particular, the survival of benefit recipiency and whether or not they're actually employed. And so this relates to sort of what are the downstream outcomes that we're looking at in both papers, right? So one is going to be the survival, which is about who's continuing to receive benefits at a particular week. We can also look at things like this total duration of receipt and also total duration of non-employment. But there's going to be a difference between thinking about sort of whether or not you're still receiving benefits, so the survival stuff, as well as this duration of non-employment. So just important to kind of keep that in mind. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Geoff's paper, and he's really wanting to understand how does the stringency of this at-fault determination affect UI and labor market outcomes. And I should just preface this for both papers. These are both sort of ongoing research projects. So if I misunderstood things from reading the papers, I hope the authors will correct it later. And so he's using this super cool quasi-random variation and assignment to more or less strict offices to vary exposure to denial of these at-fault claims. And so basically there's a lot of judgment that the people that are making these claims determinations can have. And he shows that there's this variation that across offices, some offices tend to be more lenient, some offices tend to be more stringent. He also shows that that's consistent across different demographic groups and things like that. So you might be worried that there might be differences in for different types of people, but he shows that that's actually pretty consistent, which is great. And so what did he find? So first, in terms of the kind of first stage, assignment to the strict office leads to this big increase in the claims that are denied and also big decrease in total UI benefits received. Okay, so it matters which office you're assigned to. And now he uses that to identify what's the effect of denial. And so I believe he concludes that there's a small effect of denial on the time it takes to find a new job, but he has no effect of denial on reemployment earnings. Was my reading of the paper. And just sort of a caveat here is that this is necessarily going to be very, very partial equilibrium, right? Because if we think about sort of making a change where we get rid of this at-fault determination, the individuals that are entering the unemployment insurance system are going to be very different, right? So if everybody got UI without sort of having to have any sort of determination at all, it would be much less of an unemployment insurance system, and it would be a lot more universal. So you would imagine there would be much bigger sort of general equilibrium effects if we change this policy. But like thinking about this variation along these people that are sort of just just at the margin of being getting their claim denied or not, right? So it's a small slice of sort of the UI recipients that might be moved by what type of office they're assigned to. Okay, so I wanted to take this back to kind of thinking a little bit more about the micro foundations, and I'm going to talk about it for this paper and also for the other paper. And so what does this mean about how we think about how individuals respond to unemployment insurance, so sort of behavioral response? So when I think of microfoundations, and there might be other models out there, one is that job search is costly. And so by sort of increasing benefits or changing benefits, these benefits are going to allow workers to search less, right? So this is sort of the moral hazard. You're not working as hard to find another job, or maybe you're not searching at all. And so the generosity of UI benefits are going to sort of slow down your exit into employment. So that's one margin. But another is that jobs are heterogeneous, right? And so we can imagine that sort of the benefits of receiving unemployment insurance benefits actually allows you to be more choosy about which jobs you want, which could be a really good thing in the sense that if we're sort of improving the match quality of workers to jobs, and either allowing them to go to one that has higher pay or just in general on some sort of match dimension, sort of a better quality match, that also allows them to take more time to find a job. So I think when we're talking about what's the sort of behavioral response, it's not just about sort of how quickly workers get into work, right? We also want to think about the quality of the job that they're getting into. And so I think sort of these preliminary results that Geoff is finding suggest for this marginal applicant, so this applicant whose outcome would change based on this office assignment, we're seeing little effect of denial on time to reemployment. So that suggests we're not seeing this change on this how hard are they searching margin, and then also a little effect on the reemployment earnings. So again, suggests the recipients are not being choosier. So we're sort of not seeing the sort of possible upside of getting a better quality match, and we're also not seeing as much of the possible downside in terms of sort of a big response and how hard they're searching. Okay, now let's switch to Alix's paper. So again, trying to tie this all together. And so we want to think about how this change in benefit generosity and potential benefit duration affect the labor supply, and also whether or not these are changing over the business cycle, right? And so they're using this very nice regression kink design, taking advantage of the fact that in California, and well, any state, there's a cap in maximum benefits. So individuals just below and above the cutoff are going to face different incentives, right? And so what they find, again, I believe this is what their findings are. So individuals around the kink point, they do find that benefit increases reduce UI exit rate. So it sort of slows down how fast people get out of unemployment and increases the duration of non-employment. So this is the behavioral response, or this moral hazard response potentially. And then they don't see variation in the exit rate and job finding rate over the business cycle. But they do see this impact of the potential duration. So what are these responses? Again, thinking about what's the micro foundations behind what they're finding. So, it does look like these workers are maybe reducing search effort or becoming more choosy, but I should say, I don't think we have any results in this paper about job quality or about earnings, at least that I saw. So it would be nice to kind of see if there's something going on the job finding. Or the job quality or match quality. But then the authors are also interested in examining how this varies over the business cycle, right? And I think one thing to kind of keep in mind or think more about is how the marginal recipient's really going to vary a lot over the business cycle. So going back to my schema, like thinking about what changes over the business cycle, right? So there's going to be big differences in sort of who's facing separation events. Also big differences in workers' decisions about whether or not they want to apply, right? So the benefit of applying for unemployment insurance varies a lot based on how fast you think you're going to be able to find another job. We saw during the pandemic, at least, there were sort of big changes in, how hard it was to get benefits, probably changes in sort of how things were going on in the UI office. And then also sort of other things like incentives to recertify, your job finding probabilities, things like that. So there might be a lot going on in terms of on the selection margin of sort of who is searching who is applying for benefits during a pandemic, and also whether or not they're able to get through. And I think especially if we're talking about what's going on during the pandemic, there's actually really big differences during the pandemic, right? So obviously we have these huge increases in the UI eligible population. I have some work looking at sort of characteristics of the people that lost work during the pandemic. But what's really important is also that most of the separators were actually on temporary layoff, and they were not actively searching for work, right? And then when we look at reemployment, most of this is actually coming through what looks a lot like recalls. So if we want to think about what's the labor supply response, right? in this particular context, it's going to be as much driven by employer behavior, right? So how fast my previous employer recalls me back to employment compared to whether or not I'm actually searching. And especially since a very small subset of the unemployed at least during sort of the most intensive acute phase of the pandemic, we're actually actively searching for work. That means that when we're thinking about this behavioral response, it's less about what these workers are doing and more about how quickly my employer brings me back. So that's just something to kind of think about more about, because unemployment was very different during the pandemic, in particular these temporary layoffs, that could kind of change how we're interpreting these elasticities that you're estimating. And lots of reasons why the labor supply response could have been muted, and certainly worth further exploration. So this isn't saying this isn't an important question. It's just that I think there's a lot more context that needs to be provided. Okay, and so just if I have time to go through a couple of more specific comments. So for Alix's paper, I think treating the cyclical response more systematically would be awesome, right? Right now in the paper, it's really just sort of a graphical, let's look at the picture. And I think both theoretically thinking with more clarity about how this behavioral response would vary cyclically. So in particular, thinking about the job finding rate, which is going to relate to how slack the labor market is, right? You could actually put that in specifically, right? And think about what would change in terms of job finding rate, returns to costly search, et cetera, and also things like job quality. This would also allow you to have more precise empirical specifications instead of just kind of looking year by year. We could actually look at how it varies with tightness, which again gives you a way to compare between different time periods. I'll also just say that the kinks are very wide and the bite of the kink is changing over time. So there's lots of things to think about there. And then for Geoff's paper, just, I just love that we're opening up the black box. I think that's such an important thing. And very clear and straightforward research design, but we want to think more about how to interpret results, in particular, why are we getting these differences between opposite and severity, right? Also could think about cyclical variation. And then the last thing I want to say is just, this is kudos to California Policy Lab, right? We're able to learn all these fantastic things because of the great work that group has been doing. I will say, though, that we're focused on California, which might be very different from other states, right? And so I think that it really shows that we need more of these partnerships in other states to be able to expand how we're thinking about the unemployment insurance system and some of these other systems. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Sorry that I went a little over.
It was worth every minute, Eliza. Those were fantastic comments and definitely got me thinking more. I will also say that we're starting to see the Q&A box hopping a little. So for those of you in the audience, please continue to use that. And I will turn it over to Steve Woodbury for our next presentation.
Okay, thank you, Alix. This is joint work with Marta, who is here. And our topic is motivated by a growing concern with equity in the UI system, directed both at concerns about Black workers, lower take-up and recipiency rates, concerns that Black workers tend to be heavily concentrated in low benefit states, and this recent discovery that Black workers who appear to be eligible for UI are less likely than similar white workers to receive UI. There's also been longstanding concern about women's access to unemployment insurance. Some of those concerns were addressed with the UI modernization provisions in the ARRA over a decade ago. Two papers by people who are in the room have addressed all of these questions. The main questions we're interested in are a bit different. We're going to see whether female UI claimants and claimants other than white non-Hispanics are more likely than white claimants to see their claims disputed by the employer from whom they separated, and also whether their UI claims are more likely to be denied either by the agency through a determination or adjudication or through a formal appeal. And we think these are interesting questions because experience rating of the UI system of UI payroll tax gives employers an incentive to dispute claims, either by telling the agency that the claimant separated for a reason that would make the claimant ineligible, or through the formal appeal process. And indeed, the concerns that Geoff was talking about earlier feed into this. Even if those disputes by the employer are unsuccessful, they could raise the cost or hassle that's associated with claiming UI and reduce take-up. And in some related work that Marta and I have done with Isaac Sorkin, we find that workers who were laid off from employers were more likely to dispute claims, have lower take-up rates. So here's the graph from that paper where we have employer dispute rate on the horizontal axis. You can see the take-up rates fall with increasing dispute rates. And that's consistent with employers deliberately trying to discourage workers from claiming UI. The data we're going to be using are administrative data from Washington State, 05 to 2013. We have claims records that let us look at when a worker claimed, whether the worker received, demographic characteristics, and importantly, reasons for separation that are given by the claimant and the employer. And when the claimant and the employer give different reasons for separation, we're going to consider that a dispute. We also have wage records that allow us to look at each worker's claimant history and subsequent employment. We can identify industry and the employer specifically from whom the worker separated. We also can determine monetary eligibility. And what we want to do here, and the key here is to link claims to the employer, and that allows us to observe sector effects and employer effects, both on the probability of denial and the probability of dispute. We restrict the sample to claims where the worker had just one base period employer, and that's so we can be sure we've identified an employer who would have an interest in the claim, and that gives us a sample of about 1.2 million claims. Here is a flow chart of sort of the institutional framework. The worker, of course, has to claim benefits. Once the agency determines whether the claimant is monetarily eligible, the agency has to determine whether the worker's reasons for separation were consistent with benefits. So the agency asks both the worker and the employer for the reason for separation. If there's a difference, we're going to call that a dispute. Now, the agency can determine or can find there's an issue with a claim even without getting any employer information. And that happens more often than when there's a dispute. We'll see disputes are actually fairly rare. The dispute gives rise to fact-finding on the part of the agency and a determination or adjudication. That determination can be appealed formally by either the worker or the employer. That goes to a separate agency. It leaves the Employment Security Department of Washington and goes to what's called the Office of Administrative Hearings. In any case, what we observe in the data are these items that are bolded. The other things we don't. More detail. Here is my favorite table in the paper. What we have here is a matrix showing the employer reason for separation by the claimant reason for separation. And each cell of this shows a combination of the employer reason and claimant reason, within parentheses the size of the cell and the percentage of the claims that were denied. So this is a combination of the employer saying the worker voluntarily quit. The claimant says that he or she separated due to lack of work, and about half the time those claims were denied. Now, as we know, voluntary quits in general are disqualified, but there are lots of voluntary quits that are eligible. For example, now, if a claimant who goes and takes care of an ill family member, or sickness or disability, can all be voluntary quits, which are good cause quits. And here's the other modal cell that is when aside from when there's no reporting, the other modal cell is that about 15,000 claims where the worker said the reason for separation was lack of work. The employer said it was a discharge. About a third of those were denied. This sort of points to a real ambiguity in both the law and administration of UI about the term discharge. Discharges for misconduct, work-related misconduct, are quite clearly disqualified. Other discharges, for example, when a worker simply can't perform the work or performs poorly, are generally not disqualified. And we've got a couple of footnotes with references that talk about all that. Down in the bottom right, you see, again, we've got about 1.2 million claimants, about 22% of them overall were denied. You can also see, this is sort of the first surprise, most of the time, the employer does not report a reason for separation. This is about 97% of the time they don't report a reason for separation. It's almost the mirror image of that for claimants, and about 95% of the claims, or 5%, they don't report. So claimants almost always report a reason. Employers rarely do. What we're going to do to sort out this issue of whether women and white non-Hispanic claimants are more likely to be denied is estimate 3 linear probability models, one for denial, one for dispute, and one for denial conditional on dispute. And what we're going to include are a set of indicators for gender, race, ethnicity, a vector of characteristics, including age, education, other controls, employment history, reason for separation. And then we're going to include either a set of sector effects or a set of employer effects. And that's what's going to give us the sort of traction on whether the employer is playing a role here. We're going to look at 4 specifications, one of which just gives us raw or unadjusted differences by gender and race ethnicity. When we include characteristics, that'll be adjusted. And then when we include either sector or employer, we'll be able to get at employer effects and sector effects. So what do we find? Well, here are the male-female gaps in denial and dispute rates. And what you can see, not surprisingly, is that women overall have higher denial rates by about 5.5 percentage points, but conditional on characteristics of the claim, the denial rate is actually lower. And if you include sector and employer effects, it goes down still more. So women are actually denied less often than expected, and they seem to be sorting to low denial employers. And a similar story applies to disputes. If you don't adjust, their dispute rates are higher, but conditional on the characteristics of the claim, they're actually disputed less often than expected. And again, women seem to be sorting to employers who are relatively low dispute. So it's sort of a set of unexpected findings. Again, some surprises with Hispanic claimants. Here we see that both male and female Hispanic claimants are less likely than white non-Hispanics to be denied. Same for disputes. They're part of that is explained by observables. But what you see here as you include sector and employer effects is that there's sorting of these workers, both male and female Hispanics, to high denial employers. So, and a similar story down here with dispute rates. You can see that none of the effect, by the way, of none of the higher dispute rate for males or females is explained by observables, although it's much less when you include employer and sector effects. Again, employers are moving, Hispanic workers are being employed by high dispute employers. We also see, in spite of this higher dispute rate for male Hispanics, it looks as though most of that is sort of corrected by the agency. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Next, for Black claimants, here we see something which is more along the lines of what at least I expected to begin with. We see much higher denial rates for Black claimants. Some, but not all of that gap is explained. And you see Black claimants sorting to low denial employers. So you include sector and employer effects, and these differentials seem to go away, which is the result somewhat of sorting. Slightly different story for dispute rates. Again, very little of the higher dispute rate of Black claimants is explained by characteristics, and only half of it is explained when you include employer effects. So half of this gap is explained by sorting to higher dispute employers, but the other half is not. So some of this is employer specific. In other words, employers disputing the claims of their Black workers more often than others. Do I have time for one more slide, Alex?
You take 1 more minute, Steve.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'll just do Asian claimants, because this Asians are actually, after Hispanics, the largest group of white non-Hispanics in Washington. And here you see a story that is somewhat similar to Blacks. You see a higher dispute rate. Even less of it is explained by observables. Although again, you see evidence of sorting, in this case, to low denial employers. You don't see the agency sort of correcting at all in this case. Here you see the the disputes that Asian males are subjected to greater, not much of it explained, and only half of it, again, goes away when you take account of employer effects. So again, some of this remaining gap, some of this unexplained gap here remains when you include employer effects, meaning that part of this is accounted for by sorting to low denial employers, but some of it remains after you take account of employer effects, meaning given employers are tending to dispute the claims of their Asian male claimants more than others. Thanks for listening. I'll end there, Alex.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. So next we'll turn it over to Derek. This is a presentation that, correct me if I'm wrong, Derek, but is not about unemployment insurance, but is kind of speaking to a lot of the same themes as the other 3 papers. So very excited for this one. And I think you're still muted, Derek. Perfect. And
Thanks,
yep,
Alex.
we can see you well.
Great. All right. Thanks very much. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks also to Equitable Growth for funding this project. So this is a joint paper with Bruce Meyer. And as a disclaimer, the views expressed today do not reflect the views of the Census Bureau or the state of Indiana. And all results have been reviewed for disclosure risk. Okay. So safety net programs play a key role in ensuring people against all sorts of risk, but enrolling in these programs often requires overcoming lots of administrative burdens, whether it's difficult learning about eligibility, having to fill out complicated paperwork, having to physically travel to an office for a face-to-face interview. And these burdens, on one hand, may screen out those who are less needy with a higher opportunity cost of time, but they may also screen out those who are more needy if these burdens are taxing on ability. And so given these different theoretical predictions, the effects of these burdens can depend critically on the context in which they appear. So for example, one set of burdens can have different effects across programs based on differences in enrollment procedures or populations served. And then within a program, they can also appear at multiple points, with initial effects potentially differing from dynamic effects on durations. And so this paper examines how barriers to enrollment from automating welfare services affects the take-up of multiple welfare programs, as well as who is screened out at a given application stage. And the setting that I study is the state of Indiana, which in 2007 automated caseworker assistance for 3 programs, so SNAP, TANF, and Medicaid, by outsourcing their management to the IBM Corporation. And so IBM used internet and phone platforms to replace face-to-face interactions with local caseworkers. And so this resulted in a lack of personalized assistance, a lower tolerance for errors on the part of computers and call center workers, as well as long wait times at call centers themselves. And it turns out that IBM's automated system rolled out to only 2/3 of Indiana's counties before suddenly halting in 2009. And so this creates a natural experiment that enables a comparison over time of outcomes between those counties receiving the rollout and those counties that did not receive the rollout. And so I'm going to rely on admin welfare records covering nearly 3 million program recipients in Indiana that are linked to IRS tax records at the Census Bureau. And so the longitudinal nature of these data allows me to disentangle changes along the entry and exit margins that wouldn't be possible with cross-sectional data. And the IRS tax records help to mobilize a battery of outcomes that can be used to examine targeting. Okay, so this map here shows the rollout of IBM's system over several waves. So in October 2007, you'll see that a pilot group of 12 counties received treatment in central Indiana. 5 months later, you have 27 counties in South Central Indiana that transitioned to IBM. And then in May 2008, you had 20 more counties split between Southwest Indiana and Northeast Indiana that became automated. And because the expansion was halted due to performance issues, you're left with 33 counties here in gray that were never treated. And it's worth noting that Indiana sought initially to target those counties that were less populous and more rural, since they were thought to be easier to automate. And so you're actually left with two of the largest counties, Marion County, where Indianapolis is, and Lake County in Northwest Indiana, that were avoided during the early phases of the rollout. So you might worry about different trajectories of outcomes over time between those counties. One thing I can do is to remove Marion and Lake from the control group. But after doing so, you might still worry about parallel trends. And so this figure shows trends in SNAP enrollment between treated, which are shaded here in solid, and untreated counties, minus Marion and Lake, and find strong evidence of parallel trends in SNAP enrollment over an 18-year period prior to treatment, covering multiple recessions, shaded here in gray, economic booms, and program changes. And the data for Medicaid and TANF go back less far, but even here I find that the trends evolve really quite consistently over time between the treated and untreated counties. And so given these trends, I'm going to rely on a diff and diff empirical strategy that compares outcomes between treated and untreated counties over time. So let me now show you effects on program enrollment. And so starting with SNAP, I find no pre-trends over the 12 quarters prior to treatment. And then 4 quarters after IBM automation, SNAP rolls decline pretty sharply by 15% in the treated counties relative to the untreated counties. This decline then reverses in the ensuing quarters, but it's worth noting that even 6 years after treatment was first implemented and 4 years after it was terminated, SNAP enrollment in the treated counties remains around 3% lower than in the untreated counties. If you turn next to TANF, you see an even steeper drop as a result of automation. So 1 year after automation, TANF enrollment declines by about 24% in the treated counties. In the long run, however, this difference in TANF enrollment between the treated and control counties totally disappears. And this long-term rebound can be explained by the continuous turnover among TANF recipients, as their lifetime enrollment caps imply that most recipients at the time of the rollout here would no longer be recipients 6 years later. And finally, turning to Medicaid, we see an initial reduction in enrollment of 4% 1 year after automation, which is much smaller than the effects for SNAP and TANF, but there's actually not much reversal in the decline, suggesting some permanence in the reduction of Medicaid receipt that persists beyond the life of IBM's automated system. And so given the ordeals imposed at multiple stages of the application process, it's useful to disentangle the extent to which the reductions in total enrollment are driven by either decreased entry or increased exit. And so this table shows the time averaged effects of automation on either the monthly entry rate or the monthly exit rate for each program. And so focusing first on entry rates, you see significant declines for all 3 programs, ranging from 0.03 percentage points for TANF to 0.05 percentage points for SNAP, which in absolute terms are similar in magnitude. But then if you focus next on exit, you see considerable differences across programs in the absolute increases in exit rates. And so for TANF, we find an increase in the exit rate of 1.1 percentage points, which is really driven by TANF cases within adults. And then for SNAP, we find an increase of 0.7 percentage points in the exit rate. And then for Medicaid, it's a very small, insignificant effect of 0.04 percentage points. And so these results suggest that the differences across programs and overall enrollment declines are likely driven by differential increases in exit rates rather than decreases in entry rates. And I find evidence in the paper that different recertification costs can play a key role in explaining these heterogeneous effects on exit rates. These costs tend to be higher for TANF and lower for Medicaid. So for example, the intervals for recertifying are shortest for TANF and they're longest for Medicaid. TANF recipients may also receive less assistance in staying on the program, while those eligible for Medicaid may have more avenues for assistance, including from healthcare providers that have incentive to get uninsured patients enrolled onto Medicaid. And so let me finally show some evidence on who is screened out by IBM's automated system to shed light on some of the welfare implications of the policy change. And so this table shows how average measures of well-being among SNAP recipients change in the treated counties relative to the untreated counties. And if you look over all recipients, you'll see that those remaining after treatment have lower pre-treatment income, higher benefit dollars per person, fewer years of education, and a higher likelihood of being disabled. So they're suggesting at first glance that maybe IBM screens out those who are less needy. But then if you separate effects across entrants and exiters, you see stark differences in targeting across application stages. So namely that IBM automation leads to more needy people entering, meaning those who are less needy are the ones screened out at entry, while those who are more needy are screened out at exit. And so these results are offsetting to some extent to produce overall targeting effects that are more muted. And it turns out that these results can be explained by these burdens screening out both the least and the most needy individuals. But due to differential selection of individuals into a given stage, the least needy, who are less attached to welfare programs, tend to appear at the first stage, at initial application, while the most needy, who are more attached, tend to appear at recertification. And so given these compositional differences, analyzing only the entry margin would reveal that the least needy are screened out, while analyzing the exit margin would reveal that the most needy are screened out. And these differences would be masked by a focus on overall mean effects. And so empirical studies of targeting often take either the neoclassical model of targeting or the behavioral model to explain the results. But this paper suggests that the applicability of a given theory may differ across stages based on who appears at a given stage. And so it offers a new explanation for why existing studies, which tend to focus either on initial take-up or just retention, find different results. And so you might wonder how you want to think about the optimality of IBM's automated system. So you might wonder about the relationship in particular at the entry stage between screening out those who are less needy and also just reducing type 2 errors or false positives in the benefit award process. And so using SNAP quality control microdata, I actually find that overpayment rates, of which type 2 errors are a subset, do fall sharply in Indiana after 2008 relative to the rest of the US, suggesting that some of the less needy folks may in fact be truly ineligible. So this speaks to a trade-off between allocating fewer benefits to those who are ineligible, so fewer type 2 errors, while leading more eligible folks to be rejected, so more type 1 errors. But the large increase in type 1 errors that I find is really concentrated among the more needy. And so this suggests that there's still some level of suboptimality associated with the burdens that are part of IBM's automated system. And so to conclude, this paper examines how these burdens arising from the automation of caseworker assistance impact the number and type of people applying and recertifying for these three programs. I find enrollment declines that are largest for TANF and smallest for Medicaid initially, driven mainly by differential effects on exit rates. The effects on targeting vary by stage, as those screened out at entry tend to be less needy, while those screened out at exit tend to be more needy. This paper ties into broader policy debates about the role of caseworkers, who have seen their roles diminish over time in response to perceived inefficiencies and complaints about fraud. But the lack of human contact may have different effects across stages, depending on the types of clients appearing at a given stage. And so this suggests that there are limits to one-size-fits-all policies, and there could be value in designing procedures differentially across stages based on whom you want to target. And then let me just, I'm probably over time, so let me just mention that currently using the setting to look at downstream effects of being cut off from welfare, including on health, on mortality, labor supply, child outcomes as well. So thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Derek. So I will just let everyone know that after we hear Kristen's discussant marks, we'll be turning over to Q&A. So please direct your attention also to the Q&A box and add your questions into Q&A. But yeah, Kristen, go for it. And I think you're muted, Kristen, but your slides look beautiful.
Apologies for that slow start. I know time is limited, so I will be brief and selective in my remarks. I enjoyed both papers. I will focus more on some constructive remarks than my compliments in the interest of time, but there was a lot to love about both papers. Beginning with Lachowska and Woodbury, this paper is really a fantastic opportunity to trace the steps in the claims process and is very rich in the detail on all the different places where an application might be denied and the reasons for it. I think that this paper also, with the unique data, is an opportunity to think about the potential disparate impacts of supposedly race and gender neutral policies, and also an opportunity to speak to potential bias on the part of employers in deciding when to dispute one of these claims. The paper is really strong, as I said, in describing the places where there can be administrative burden. And what's unique about UI is the fact that there's both a state agency evaluating claims, but also the opportunity for an employer to weigh in. One thing that didn't come through so much in the presentation was just how rare these disputes are. And I think that that's one interesting descriptive finding. Although employers have a financial incentive to question or dispute claims, nevertheless, disputes are very rare, but they're really interesting when they do occur, understanding disparities there. So one place where I feel like the paper could really punch up the contribution is in making some meaning of the different places where there might be differences across gender and race groups, and thinking through what would be the reasons or explanations for it. And right now the paper's pretty focused on sort of explaining away the differences, but I think unpacking the places where there are some reversals or changes is some place where the paper could go a bit further. I'll just be very selective here, but I think that there are a lot of places where even supposedly neutral policies may have disparate impacts. And so we can imagine toxic workplaces or discriminatory on-the-job conditions, pushing people out, certain race ethnic groups disproportionately. And that might lead to more disputes around reasons for separation. There may be other conditions that lead to disparate impacts. I think there's a lot of interesting possibility for unconscious or conscious bias, for favoritism in when employers choose to dispute a claim. So I think although that's uncommon, it's really interesting. Just a couple quick words on the gender results. As Steve described, women are more likely to be denied than men, but that's completely explained either by some demographic characteristics or employment history or reason for separation. But from the paper right now, it wasn't clear which of those things explained the gender disparity. So I think it'd be interesting to talk about which of those factors is driving that. On racial disparities, as the paper notes, the patterns are more complex and they're interesting, give us a lot of food for thought. It's interesting to imagine unpacking why is there a lower denial rate for Hispanics a priori. I could think of a lot of reasons why I might have predicted the opposite. Their data allow them to control for a lot of things, and then there are residual disparities for Asians and American Indian claimants. What can we make of residual disparities? How could it be that there would be these differences once we've controlled for so many other things? And I think that there was a residual difference in dispute rates for Black males and Asian claimants, which I think do point to the potential role of HR managers potentially having some bias in how they're deciding which claims to dispute. For broader implications, the data is very rich. They pertain to Washington State, and I think it would be interesting to put this in a broader context. Do we think Washington State is a conservative test of employer bias in disputes? How else does Washington State fit into the broader landscape? Also, I'm sure people will be interested in what you would have to say about the implications for the pandemic UI process. So I think it would be good to speak to that because I know people will wonder. So moving right along to the Wu and Meyer paper. Again, many things to love about this paper. I think we can all relate to the frustrations of administrative burden. I have many examples from my own life wrestling with automated systems. But when we think about wrestling with an automated system to access urgently needed food or life-saving medicine, the stakes are obviously much, much higher. One of the things I really appreciated about this paper was the rich detail in setting the stage about just the absolutely chaotic rollout of this automation system. Call centers were overwhelmed. Tens of thousands of unanswered calls, no continuity in who is managing the case, 283,000 lost documents. It was just an absolute mess. And I think the paper does a really nice job of conveying that and setting the stage. It also has a phenomenal research design, terrific data, and persuasive results that this automation led to a reduction in approved applications, both at the time of entry and at recertification. And there was also a really important result that these declines were sustained even after the rollback of automation. Even after IBM left, there was still these declines in SNAP and Medicaid that persisted. So although there were many, many things I loved about this paper, I had one very strenuous objection, and that was to the section on the claims about better targeting and effective screening during the IBM automation. So there's a section of the paper that Derek talked about at the end that looks at measures of neediness and interprets the analysis as suggesting that automation led to better targeting at the time of application because the less needy applicants were screened out. And there's probably a dozen places where this language of better targeting and effective screening is used. And there are a number of reasons why I take issue with this and why I think it's a really, really important thing to get right and to be careful about. First, eligibility criteria are objective. They are not relative. Screening out people who are less needy doesn't mean we have screened out people who are ineligible. Second, being less needy in the way it's operationalized in the paper is conflated with having a more complicated case. If you have lagged earnings, a more complex assets and earnings history, it's almost by definition going to be a more onerous job to provide all that documentation. There are more places where you could get into trouble with an automated system that's not able to scrutinize and take into account nuances. Further, our welfare policy is really focused on encouraging people to work as much as they can. And so I think that the data are very consistent with a story where automation penalizes people who are trying really hard to work, but then a need arises. And need is time varying. And the way that need is operationalized kind of looks back and looks at lagged earnings. So it's not well designed to capture these need-based moments. And so I think there's a real risk here of saying this is an effective screening process when it could very easily be a not effective screening process in ways that are really problematic and important to get right. So I think you need to be really careful with the interpretation here. And in places in the paper, you come to a very different interpretation that these declines are really driven by the messiness of the rollout. And so I think that there's really an imperative to be more circumscribed in the language here about how to interpret these findings. Automation seems to have disproportionately screened out those with more complex documentation requirements. Whether or not they were eligible is really hard to determine. Further, and I know time is limited, so I'm almost done here, but Derek also cited as evidence for effective screening the decline in error rates that coincided with the IBM automation. But when I stare at the figure on on error rates, I see something quite different. So this grayish line shows that the overpayment rates in Indiana were high compared to the national overpayment rates during automation. And that big drop seems to happen after IBM went away. So the IBM contract ended at the end of 2009. I see the big drop 2009 to 2010. So I think that's another reason to be really careful in assuming that automation screened out people who were ineligible. It just doesn't seem like the data is there, or the evidence is compelling on that one point. So in the interest of time, I'll skip over some other parts and just wrap up by saying, I think this paper, in spite of that strong objection, I think this paper makes a really important contribution, showing that this IBM rollout was in fact a mess, that it led to declines in access to crucial safety net programs, both at application and at recertification, and has the opportunity to answer really important questions about who was screened out and which problems might be fixable and which are just going to be never able to be handled by automation. And so I think one potential policy implication that's different from the one you drew is that more complex cases perhaps should be prioritized for human review, and that this one size fits all, maybe automation can't handle every single case. In the broader landscape, I don't think automation is going away. So I think it would be really valuable to consider, can this work better? How can this work better? How can these systems be improved and designed to complement rather than undermine or replace the important work that case managers do?
Excellent. Thank you so much for those comments, Kristen. So much food for thought. So again, to folks in the audience, feel free to continue to drop questions into Q&A. Also, I wanted to make sure people knew that Marta Lachowska, Steve's co-author, is joining us for the Q&A session, which is such a delight. Okay, so before we jump into a little less than 15 minutes of question and answer, I can't help myself. I'm going to take a little bit of moderator's privilege just to say how much I liked these papers and why. So just one quick thing to say is it really struck me as, you know, as we were talking, when we got to the fourth paper, I was like, wow, these are all states. You know, you'd expect in a session with 4 papers, we'd get one using CPS data or something like that. So I just want to echo Eliza's comments about what a lift it is to use state administrative data, how hard it is, how much, you know, legwork you have to put in the beginning. But also I think these 4 papers really show us what rich results you can get when you build those relationships with states and do that work. So that is really exciting. And then a second thing, first of all, I was excited by Derek's paper overall, like how beautiful of a design and how interesting of results. And then looking at the 3 unemployment insurance papers, I also just wanted to say, you know, when I started looking at UI papers, you know, this literature about 10 years ago, as a sociologist entering largely an economist sandbox, I felt like a lot of things seem to me to be missing. Like where are we talking about institutions, the big legal institution that I'm seeing throughout this, the way employers are playing in this space, the very kind of like thin treatment of the way demographic characteristics could be driving the way the program operates. And what an incredible treat to see this set of 3 papers that really take these factors into account. So like you've really made my week. Okay, so that's why I love these papers so much. I know time is pretty limited, but I did want to just offer folks an opportunity if anyone wanted to respond to their discussant comments. So feel free to jump in if you wanted to.
I just want to say a quick word. Really immense thanks to Kristen for your thoughtful comments. And I think I largely agree with a lot of what you said. I think it's important to, and you know, we'll revisit the paper and kind of look at this. It's important to make the point that those who appear to be maybe, you know, on a series of, you know, dimensions, urban temporary income, who maybe appear to be quote unquote less needy, are not in fact not needy. Right. But I think what the paper is trying to say is that it seems to be that, on this exit stage, that it really appears to be those who are, have very complex situations and who have low education, they have higher disability, are really the ones who are being screened out. And so if there were a stage you'd want to target first, it'd probably be that stage. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't also help those who are, appearing at the initial stage. But, point taken for sure. And I really appreciate your comments.
I just want to thank Kristen too for her comments. I think a lot of her questions are the questions that we have been scratching our heads about and say we've got to get back and do some more work. So thank you. You sort of confirmed our view of what we still need to do.
So thanks, Eliza, for your comments. All really great. I wanted to just comment on one, which actually is a concern of mine that I'm really interested in, this kind of idea that this is partial equilibrium, right? So if you change these rules, you are going to see other responses that we're kind of not accounting for yet. So I'm super interested in this idea of how changing these rules would lead to more and different people filing a claim in the first place, or even separating from an employer. I have another paper on that topic as well. And so I think, we have some hopes that we're going to try to address this. And so we'll see what happens. One counter argument I would make is that if you propose removing these at-fault criteria entirely, yes, you would assume that you would see giant responses, right? If you propose more marginally changing them, I'm not so sure, right? It's not really clear to me how salient some of this stuff is to a worker. So again, we're going to try to say more about this in future versions of the paper. So hopefully we can do that. Thanks.
I'm just going to jump in also as we go in reverse chronological order. Say thanks, Eliza, for the discussant remarks. Particularly the next step of job quality. Totally agree. So important. That is one of the next steps that I look forward to the most in terms of a next paper from here. And we do have some exciting preliminary results on that too. In terms of who is the marginal claimant over the business cycle, also definitely agree. We've done some sort of reweighting analysis by industry. It's limited. We're doing more. We're pushing out that frontier in the next iteration. And then also just finally, great specific comments in general on the framing. And I loved your diagrammatic way of thinking through the cycle and your comments on framing with slackness. So thanks very much. Well appreciated.
Excellent. Well, I think we can see that there was a really robust and wonderful back and forth between the discussants and the papers. I know I enjoyed it. So for the Q&A, I wanted to start out with kind of two specific questions for Josh about your, just basically about how your paper was working. So the first one is from Marta Lachowska. How big is the dispersion in the UI office denial rates, right? So it's pretty interesting to know that this is happening. Like, how big is it? What exactly is this looking like? And then we have a question from Raphael from the University of Southern California, of SC. I got that California system right, I think. Regarding the second talk, Josh, do we have results on how the different relaxations of the benefit criteria may affect different demographic groups?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Alex. So to Marta's question, the average denial rate overall is about 58%. There's about a 5 percentage point difference across the 14 offices. And so this is conditional on time fixed effects because that kind of office assignment mechanism changes over time, right? So that's why we do it that way. So kind of small, maybe. Our SDAT is still pretty big, so we feel pretty good about it. We do two things to deal with this. One, we use kind of alternative IV methods like LIML and UGIVE, right, to kind of show that we're robust to this concern. Second, we also have a design that exploits only caseworker level variation. And there, that variation is much bigger, right? Which you kind of would expect, right? These rules are subjective inherently, unavoidably. And so across individual caseworkers, it kind of has to be this way. And we get kind of similar results there too. And we're pushing those a bit more, hopefully to release them one day. And then for Raphael's question, so I'm not sure whether he meant kind of the first stage or the second stage, right? So I'll answer both. So for monotonicity reasons, you might be concerned that this difference in office leniency varies for different types of claimants. That's a problem for our design because it invalidates that assumption. We show in the paper that's not the case. So the offices that are more lenient for any kind of group of claimants you want to look at. for the actual effect on unemployment duration, what we see is that broadly less advantaged groups have smaller responses, right? So like, for example, the lowest quartile of prior earnings has the smallest non-employment response by quite a big margin, by it's like maybe a third or a fourth of the size of the rest of the quartiles, right? A similar kind of thing for gender and for race.
Excellent. And then we have another question for Geoff, but it's, I think, a hard question. So I want to extend it to all of the UI experts, discussants, and presenters on the panel, which is that, okay, so your paper shows a much more nuanced understanding of how non-monetary eligibility works than in most of the rest of the literature. So that's a big compliment. But then the hard question is, how would this kind of more nuanced understanding affect the way we read the rest of the literature? So like if every paper, I think what this means is like if every paper took this kind of more complex view of what it means to be non-monetarily eligible and didn't just say, you know, you're classified as a quit, and so you're not eligible, like how would that change the way that we look?
I think I would say two things I think are reflected in actually a lot of my work. Is that how I would think about it is a lot of people tend to think the UI literature is huge and kind of like this stuff is done and we know the answers, right? But the reality is this program is extremely complicated, right? So there are a lot of policy parameters that you want to think about, like the ones that I'm studying. And then kind of the next step is when you think about those different policy parameters, it also leads you to think about different responses, right? So this idea of like an ex-ante moral hazard, where more generous UI leads to more separations, is something you wouldn't worry about if you thought that all fired workers were ineligible, right? But once you open that door, you realize, hey, there's more questions here we need to answer. But I'll stop monopolizing time here and let somebody else chime in.
I agree, and I actually think there's another point, which is this idea of UI take-up has been viewed as a fairly straightforward one, right? What is the proportion of UI eligibles who actually apply? Well, UI eligibility is well, it's not that subjective, but you don't know, you cannot know. It's only determined through a quasi-judicial process. And it's, you know, it's impossible to know a priori what it's going to be. So that's kind of a holy grail we're never going to achieve, I think.
Did anyone else want to weigh in on that question? Okay, well, yeah, it's very interesting and exciting to see that we're diving into this holy grail. Like we're trying to solve the question that no one's sure we can solve. Okay, and then there's a question for Alix Bell that's you know, I think you kind of got to this some at your slide, but, you know, how do you see the context of the pandemic affecting the behavioral responses that you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had one bullet maybe on my conclusion, but I think it's still, you know, a big question for researchers. There's a lot that's changed during the pandemic. You know, we talked about the type of person that's changed, but there's so much in the environment that's changed in terms of other government spending from other government programs, which could infuse claimants with liquidity and lower responsiveness. There's, you know, a lot of people have talked about the overall lack of jobs, you know, and the public health crisis's impact on the availability of jobs. I think that there are a lot of these factors that, you know, you would think theoretically would push toward lower elasticities. And, you know, I think that's why there are questions going forward about how much of this is going to extrapolate to future recessions, how much of this is sort of specific to the public health nature and to the rest of the government response here. And I think that's why we want to be, you know, we want to take this with a grain of salt and be a little bit hesitant in terms of how we extrapolate.
Excellent. And so then in the last 2 minutes, I know that we have a lot of experts on the screen, so I just wanted to see if anyone had a question for one of their fellow presenters or a comment or a thought.
So I guess I have one question for Steve. So I think what jumps out to me is, you know, this kind of employer level variation and these disputes and denials is super interesting. And I know from working with similar data, we don't know a lot about these employers. So I wonder if your team has thought at all about, you know, trying to improve that, right? Can we learn more about who these employers are and what differentiates them?
Right. That's one of our next steps is to actually do an employer level analysis. What we've done so far is strictly claims, using the claim as the unit of observation. And we want to use the employer. That's sort of what we were doing in the work with Isaac. And I think if we go back to looking at employers, we could learn a lot. I agree. Thank you.
Excellent. So we probably have like 30 seconds left to go. So I'll just, I think I probably can't state anymore how much I enjoyed this session and how grateful I am for the work that everyone's doing on these questions that are both intellectually interesting and incredibly important for public policy and real people's lives. So kudos to all of you. And I'm also really looking forward to hopefully seeing everyone throughout the rest of this virtual grantee conference. So thanks, everybody, and bye-bye.